Reed Calloway had always believed money could buy every solution, including life itself. He was the kingpin who controlled half of Chicago's underworld, his empire stretching from the darkest blocks of the South Side to the highest penthouses in the Loop, and his days turned between negotiations that smelled of gunpowder, phone calls at 2 o'clock in the morning, and dinners where the person seated across from him never dared look him straight in the eye. For his mother, Cordelia Calloway, 78 years old, he had spent everything power could reach. Geriatric doctors from Mayo Clinic were flown in every month. The country's top therapy specialists were brought to her bedside. Nurses stood watch around the clock. The newest medical equipment was installed inside the mansion itself, but none of it worked. Cordelia still lay in the bed on the 3rd floor, her body stiff with severe arthritis, and her spirit even harder than bone, hardened by 4 years of loneliness, and by the memory of a bullet tearing through her husband's chest right in front of their own gate. Every night when he came home, Reed stopped outside his mother's door for exactly 1 second. He listened. For 4 years, all he had heard was silence, and he had grown used to thinking that silence was normal. He didn't know that silence was a cry for help. 6 nurses had quit in 4 months. Doctors who charged $1,000 only shook their heads. But Cordelia wasn't dying of illness. She had once been the jazz singer who could make the whole South Side hold its breath, her contralto voice deep as velvet, her eyes closed in the middle of a high note, and one man sitting at the corner table every night who never applauded because he said applause was for strangers, and he loved her. When that man fell in front of their gate with 3 bullets in his chest, Cordelia's voice died with him. 4 years, not a single note. 4 years, not a single smile. The room on the 3rd floor had everything money could buy: a high-end hospital bed, silk curtains, oil paintings, a heart monitor. But it lacked the one thing she needed most: someone willing to stay long enough to hear her breathe. Then one morning, the doorbell rang at 6:55. The person who stepped inside wasn't a doctor, wasn't a nurse, wasn't a specialist. She was only a 27-year-old girl named Briar Ashford, her brown hair tied up in haste, the fading shadow of an old bruise still on her face, $47 in her bag, and roughened hands that had never known how to hold anyone without pain. She came to clean the house, not to save anyone. But sometimes a miracle doesn't come from the most qualified person. Sometimes it comes from the one who knows pain most deeply, and that is where this story begins. If this story touches your heart, press like so, I'll know you're here. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change an entire day. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time. Press subscribe so you won't miss the next part. Sully led Briar through the black iron gate that stood nearly 10 feet high, then along the gray stone path to the front door. Inside, the mansion opened like a dream whose dreamer had died a long time ago. The black marble floor gleamed so perfectly that Briar could see her own reflection beneath her feet, pale and small inside the vastness of the space. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, each clear piece like a drop of water frozen in midair, beautiful in a way that felt frigid. The furniture was upholstered in charcoal leather. The dark oak bookshelves held not a trace of dust. The white porcelain vase on the console table held no flowers, only stood there like an open mouth that had nothing to say. Everything was perfect. Everything was expensive. And everything was dead. Briar knew it at once, by the instinct that over 20 years of surviving in the houses of strangers had sharpened inside her. She could read the air of a house in 10 seconds. The wealthy families who had taken her in when she was a child had owned houses like this too. Floors polished to a shine, expensive furnishings, not a laugh anywhere, not a scratch on the wall, beautiful on the outside, ice cold underneath, the kind of houses where she had always known she would be returned. Reed was waiting for her in the living room. Black suit, tie loosened by one notch, a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes passing over her for exactly 3 seconds before returning to the screen of his phone. He spoke without lifting his head, his voice as flat as the marble beneath her feet. The kitchen is in the back. The bedrooms are on the 2nd floor. My mother is on the 3rd. Don't disturb her. Keep everything clean and in its place. That's all. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from, didn't ask about the bruise on her face that had faded but still left yellow at the corner of her eye. He handed her a spare key, then walked away, his Oxford shoes striking the stone floor in an even rhythm, each footstep echoing and then dying in the empty space. Briar watched him go, closing her hand tightly around the key in her palm. Icy. Metal. Like every key she had ever been given and later had taken back. She started in the kitchen, opened cabinets, wiped down shelves, checked expiration dates in the pantry. She worked slowly, carefully, without making a sound she didn't need to make. That was how she had learned to survive as a child in other people's houses. Don't take up space. Don't draw attention. Don't give anyone a reason to remember that you exist. At noon, she went upstairs to dust the rooms on the second floor. As she passed the staircase leading to the third, she heard something. Not a human voice. The sound of something heavy hitting the floor, dull and solid, like someone had shoved an object off a table. She stopped and looked up. Sully was passing by and shook his head. Don't mind it. She does that a lot. Briar didn't ask another question, but she remembered it. She knew the difference between something falling by accident and something being thrown. That sound wasn't an accident. That was someone trying to make noise because it was the only way left to say, I'm still here. On the second day, Briar arrived at exactly 7, just as she had the day before. Sully had gone out early with Reed. The mansion was shrouded in a heavy stillness. She cleaned the kitchen, made oatmeal, and left it on the table for Cordelia, according to the instructions Sully had left behind, then started wiping down the second floor. Everything was ordinary until she heard it. Not the sound of something falling, the sound of glass shattering, sharp, clean, unmistakable, from the third floor. Briar set the cleaning cloth down. Her heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from instinct. 23 years of living in other people's houses had taught her that the sound of breaking glass was never a small thing. She climbed the stairs, moving slowly, one hand on the railing. Cordelia's bedroom door was open. On the floor, white pills had rolled everywhere among the broken glass. A bottle of antidepressants lay on its side, the cap thrown loose, the label wet from the water that had spilled with the glass. Cordelia sat on the bed, her back against the pillows, both hands resting on her lap. She wasn't looking at the pills scattered across the floor. She was looking straight at Briar. That look wasn't a plea for help. It wasn't an apology. It was a challenge. She was speaking without opening her mouth. There. What are you going to do? Pick it all up and walk out like everyone else. Briar knew that look. She had worn it herself. Every time she was transferred to a new foster family. Every time a social worker stepped into her room with a pitying face and the words, "You'll be fine." She had looked back at them that exact way. I dare you to really care. Because if nobody really cares, then at least I won't have to be disappointed. Briar didn't walk in right away. She didn't kneel to gather the pills. She didn't call for anyone. She stood in the doorway with her arms hanging at her sides, and she looked back. Silence. Not the silence of fear or awkwardness, the silence of someone saying, I see you, and I'm not going anywhere. Cordelia waited. 1 second. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. She was used to this. People always looked away first, or sighed, or shook their heads, then bent down to gather the pills and disappeared behind the door. All 6 nurses before her had done that. But Briar didn't look away. She stood there, her eyes steady, without pity, without judgment, simply looking, as if she were saying, I know what you're doing, and I'm not afraid of it. Cordelia was the one who looked away first, for the first time in 4 years. Only then did Briar step inside. She knelt and picked up the pills one by one, slowly, without hurry. She gathered the broken glass with her bare hands, carefully, with the practiced ease of someone used to picking up sharp things without leaving herself cut. She set the medicine bottle back on the bedside table, wiped up the spilled water, and put the glass back in place. She didn't say a single word through any of it. When she was done, she stood, brushed off her knees, and walked to the door. Then before leaving the room, without turning back, she said exactly 1 sentence. I know what it feels like to want to smash everything. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't shaking, wasn't trying to sound warm or gentle. It was only the truth, plain and bare as the white pills scattered on the floor. Then she walked away, down the stairs, back to her work, as though nothing had happened. Cordelia sat on the bed and watched the narrow back of the young woman disappear beyond the frame of the door. 4 years. 6 nurses, 3 doctors, 2 therapists. All of them had looked at her with pity. All of them had tried to fix her. All of them had left. This girl didn't pity her, didn't try to fix her, didn't try to understand. She only looked at her. And in that look, Cordelia saw something she hadn't seen in anyone in 4 years. The kind of understanding that only comes from someone who has walked through the same kind of darkness. 3 days passed after the incident with the shattered medicine bottle. Briar didn't mention it again, and neither did Cordelia. But something had changed in the space between them. Something fragile and hard to name. Like a spider's thread stretched across a doorway that both of them could see but neither one touched. Briar still arrived at exactly 7 every morning. Still cleaned the kitchen first, prepared the food ahead of time, then went upstairs to dust the 2nd floor. Today Sully gave her one more task, to wipe down the hallway on the 3rd floor, and she nodded without asking a question. She carried the bucket and cloth upstairs, started at the end of the hall, and knelt to wipe each tile one by one. Cordelia's bedroom door stood slightly open, just as it did every day, the opening wide enough for the light from the window inside to spill a pale yellow line across the hallway floor. Briar didn't look in. She didn't stop. She only kept wiping. And then she forgot. Her hands were wringing out the cloth. Her knees were damp. The sharp scent of floor cleaner stung lightly in her nose, and something inside her began to tremble before she even realized it. A melody. No words, no name, only a line of notes she had hummed since she was 4 or 5 years old. Back in the nights of that first foster home, when the room was dark, the door was locked from the outside, and there was nobody to pat her back or tell her a story. She had lulled herself to sleep with that melody, made up out of nothing, learned nowhere, heard from no one. It wasn't beautiful in any proper musical sense. It was simply the only sound she had in the dark, and she had clung to it the way a drowning person clings to the last rope before going under. The years passed, and that melody became a habit. She hummed it while washing dishes, while mopping floors, while walking home late at night through streets with no lights. She never turned it into words, never sang it out loud. It only rumbled softly in her throat, enough for her to hear, enough to remind her that she was still alive. Today, in the hallway of the Calloway Mansion's 3rd floor, that habit rose again without her knowing it. Inside the room, Cordelia lay on the bed, her eyes turned toward the window as they always were. But when the melody slipped through the crack in the door, she stopped. Not stopped moving, because she hardly moved at all. She stopped breathing. For half a second, then she breathed again, more slowly, as if she were trying to hear more clearly, without letting anyone know she was listening. Cordelia recognized something in it. Not the melody itself, because it was so simple it almost didn't deserve to be called music. She recognized the way it was sung, the way a person hums when she isn't singing for anyone else, only for herself, only to survive the night, only because if she stops, the silence will swallow her whole. Cordelia knew that kind of singing. She had once sung that way herself, before the stage, before the spotlight, before the applause, before there was a man at the corner table every night, back when she had still been 16-year-old Cordelia Mays on the south side, sitting on the back steps of a damp rented house, humming alone in the dark because her mother was drunk inside and she didn't dare go in. She had sung to survive. The girl in the hallway was singing to survive. By the time Briar had wiped almost to the bedroom door, she realized what she was doing. The hum in her throat had carried farther than she thought in the stillness of the hallway. She stopped at once, as if she had been caught doing something wrong. Her back stiffened. Her hand tightened around the cloth. She glanced into the room through the narrow opening and caught Cordelia looking toward her. It wasn't the challenging stare from the day of the broken medicine bottle. It wasn't the empty gaze from the first day either. This look was different, as if Cordelia were trying to remember something she had believed was gone forever. Briar swallowed. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make noise." Cordelia didn't answer. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head, didn't turn her face away. She only looked at Briar for a few more seconds, then blinked slowly and turned back toward the window. But this time it was different from every other time. This time she didn't turn away because she wanted Briar to disappear. She turned away because if she looked for 1 second longer, she was afraid the girl would see what was rising up behind 4 frozen years. Briar didn't know that. She only saw that Cordelia hadn't sent her away, and for Briar, not being sent away was already a great deal. She lowered her head, finished wiping the rest of the hallway, gathered the bucket, and went downstairs. She didn't hum again. That evening, when Sully went upstairs to collect the breakfast tray he had left outside Cordelia's room that morning, as usual, he stopped and stared. The toast had been bitten through by more than half. The glass of orange juice was down by more than a third. A few pieces of melon were left on the fruit plate, but the strawberries were gone. Sully stood there for several seconds, frowning. He had picked up that tray every day for 4 years. For 4 years, the toast came back almost untouched, maybe with one corner broken off at most, before being set back down. Today, more than half the slice was gone. He didn't say a word. He carried the tray downstairs, washed it clean, and put everything back in its place. But when he set the last plate into the rack, he looked toward the kitchen door where Briar had left 2 hours earlier, and for the first time in a very long while, Sully found himself wondering what that girl had done on the 3rd floor. The next morning, Sully left a note on the kitchen table before heading out with Reed. Clean the storage room on the 3rd floor. Far end of the hall on the left. Sort and keep what should stay, or throw out what isn't being used. Briar folded the note and slipped it into her pocket, then carried a bucket, cloths, a black trash bag, and went up to the 3rd floor. The storage room sat at the end of the hall, across from Cordelia's bedroom, behind a heavy wooden door that Briar had to push open with her shoulder. Inside, it was dark, with the smell of dampness mixed with old wood and decaying paper. She pulled the chain on the ceiling light, and a pale yellow glow spread across stacks of cardboard boxes, old chairs draped in white cloth, and a bookshelf with one broken leg leaning crookedly against the wall. The dust was so thick that when Briar stepped inside, each footstep left a clear print on the floor, as though she were walking across fresh snow. No one had come in here for a very long time. She began at the right corner, sorting through the cardboard boxes, opening each one, checking what was inside, making separate piles for what should be kept and what should be thrown away. Most of it was old household clutter, stained tablecloths, porcelain dishes with pieces missing, broken table lamps. Then she reached the left corner. A wooden crate sat at the bottom, heavier than the others. Its lid fitted tight but not locked. Briar opened it and stopped. Inside were dozens of vinyl records, standing upright in paper sleeves. Some of the covers yellowed with age, some still glossy as if they had never been opened. Beside the records was a rolled stack of old posters. She pulled one out, carefully slipped off the brittle rubber band that was nearly split through, and spread it across the floor. The poster showed a jazz club, and in slanted lettering across the top were the words, "The Velvet Room." Beneath that was a performance schedule with names she didn't recognize. Except for one, Cordelia Mays. She looked at that name longer than she needed to, then turned back to the crate and lifted each vinyl record out one by one, wiping away the dust with a soft cloth. The 3rd record she picked up had a white label with a blue border and neat lettering, Cordelia Mays, Live at the Velvet Room, 1972. Briar turned the record over and looked at the back. There was no song list, only one small handwritten line in black ink, faded with time. The writing was too small to read clearly in the weak light, but she could see the slight tremor in the script, the handwriting of someone writing more with feeling than with a steady hand. She set the record aside and kept searching through the crate. At the bottom was a record player, smaller than she had expected, in a dark brown leather case with metal clasps gone dull with age, but still able to snap open. She lifted the lid, checked it. The needle was still there. The turntable still moved smoothly. It still worked. Briar sat there in the middle of the storage room, looking at the record player in her lap, the vinyl record on the floor, the poster for the Velvet Room spread out at her feet. And she thought of Cordelia in the bedroom across the hall, lying in bed, eyes fixed on the window, ears perhaps catching the faint sounds of Briar moving things around in the storage room. She didn't think for long. She stood, took the record player in one hand and the vinyl in the other, and crossed the hallway. She knocked lightly against the half-open door with the back of her hand, didn't wait for an answer, and stepped inside. Cordelia looked at her, then looked at what she was carrying, and something changed in her eyes. Not much, only a flicker, like a candle shivering in the wind and then growing still again, but Briar saw it. She didn't say a word. She set the record player on the table by the window, where the afternoon light fell just enough for the label on the record to catch the glow. She placed the vinyl gently on the turntable, the side with the name facing upward. Cordelia Mays, her maiden name, the name of the woman she had been before she became a wife, before she became a mother, before she became a widow. When Briar was done, she stepped back. She didn't press play. She didn't say she wanted to hear it. She didn't ask whether Cordelia wanted to hear it. She only left it there, ready, waiting. Then, she turned and walked out of the room, as quietly as she had entered, and went back to the storage room to continue her work. Inside the bedroom, Cordelia looked at the record player. Looked at it for a long time. Her eyes settled on the name printed on the label and didn't move away. Her right hand lifted from the bedspread, slowly, painfully, her finger joints stiff as rusted metal, reaching toward the machine, but it stopped halfway. Her hand hung there in the air for several seconds, trembling, then lowered again. She didn't touch it, but she didn't call anyone in to take it away either. The next morning, Briar went up to the 3rd floor earlier than usual, carrying a cleaning cloth and a bottle of glass spray to wash the hallway windows. As she passed Cordelia's room, she glanced through the narrow opening in the door and saw that the record player was still sitting exactly where she had placed it the day before, the vinyl still resting on the turntable, the needle still not lowered. No one had touched it, but no one had taken it away either. Briar didn't stop. She walked straight to the window at the end of the hall, began spraying the glass, and wiped it clean. She had finished about half a pane when she heard a sound from inside Cordelia's room. Not the sound of something falling, not the sound of glass breaking. A human voice, low and rough, the voice of someone who hadn't spoken much in a very long time, so long that her throat had nearly forgotten how to make sound. "What was that you were singing yesterday?" Briar stopped, the cloth still pressed against the glass. She turned and looked toward the bedroom door. Cordelia wasn't looking into the hallway. She was still facing the window inside her room, but the question was clearly meant for Briar. It was the first time Cordelia had spoken to her on her own, without merely reacting to something. Not the defiant stare from the day of the broken medicine bottle. Not the quiet permission of the day Briar had hummed in the hallway. "This time?" she asked. She wanted to know. Briar set the cloth down on the windowsill, walked to the doorway, and stood there. "I don't know the name of it, ma'am. It's just a melody I've remembered since I was little." Cordelia still didn't turn her head, but she spoke again, and this time her voice was a little less hoarse, as though her throat was beginning to remember how to work again with each sentence. "Sing it again." 2 words, not a polite request, not a command. The words of someone who was thirsty and had just caught sight of water. Briar stepped into the room slowly and stopped beside the chair near the bed, but she didn't sit down. She stood there with her arms at her sides, and suddenly realized she had never sung for anyone before. That melody belonged only to her. It was something she had hidden in her throat for more than 20 years. Something that only came out when no one else was around, when she was alone in a dark room, alone on the walk home late at night, alone in a cold bathroom in foster homes whose names she didn't want to remember. To sing for someone else meant letting another person see the most fragile part of her, and Briar had learned very early that letting people see how breakable you were was an invitation for them to snap you in half. But Cordelia's eyes, when she finally turned to look at her, weren't the eyes of someone who would break anyone. They weren't the eyes of an audience waiting to be entertained. They were the eyes of someone who was suffocating and had just seen another person open a window. Briar drew in a breath, slow, deep, and began to hum. The familiar melody, nameless, wordless, only a line of rising and falling notes she had carried inside her chest since she was 4 years old. Her voice was soft, trembling slightly on the first note, like someone reaching out a hand without knowing whether the person on the other side would take it. But she didn't stop. The second note came steadier. The third found its breath. And then the melody flowed out naturally, the way it had always flowed on those nights when she was alone. Except this time there was someone listening. Cordelia closed her eyes. Not because she was tired, not because she wanted to sleep. She closed them the way she used to close them on stage at the Velvet Room, when she reached the highest part of a song, when the music was no longer something she was making, but something moving through her. Her face changed. The lines around her eyes and mouth, which had been drawn tight for 4 long years, slowly began to loosen, like ice melting under the first sunlight of spring. No pain, no defense, no anger, only listening. For the first time in 4 years, Cordelia Calloway's face looked like the face of someone living, instead of someone merely enduring. Briar finished the melody, and the final note faded softly into the air. Silence returned, but this silence wasn't heavy the way it had once been. It was softer now, like a blanket that had just been shaken out and laid smooth. Cordelia opened her eyes, looked at Briar, and spoke, her voice still rough, but with something warmer moving beneath it. "You don't know how beautiful your singing is." Briar didn't know what to say. She stood there for 1 more second, then lowered her head slightly, turned toward the door, picked up the cloth and the bottle of glass spray from the hallway windowsill, and went back to work. Her hands trembled a little when she wrung out the cloth, but she didn't let anyone see. That week passed. Then the week after, when Sully checked Cordelia's medicine cabinet on schedule, he realized the bottle of antidepressants was still more than a third full, nearly 2 weeks behind where it should have been. He looked at the bottle, then looked up toward the ceiling where the third floor lay above him, and said nothing. No one said a word about it. It simply formed on its own. Every morning Briar arrived at 7 o'clock, cleaned the kitchen, made oatmeal or eggs and left them ready, wiped down the dining table, then went up to the third floor. She carried a cleaning cloth and a bottle of glass spray as though she were going up there to work, but both of them knew she wasn't going up to dust. She stepped into Cordelia's room, stood by the window, drew in a deep breath, and began to hum. In those first days, Cordelia only listened. She lay in bed with her eyes closed, her face relaxed, her breathing slowing with the melody. But on the 4th day, while Briar was humming the familiar passage, she heard a faint tapping sound, rhythmic, steady. Not the sound of a machine or a clock. She opened her eyes and saw Cordelia's index finger tapping against the wooden bed frame, slowly, exactly in time. The tip of her finger was inflamed from years of arthritis, and every tap had to hurt. But she didn't stop. Briar said nothing. She kept singing, and the tapping kept time beside her. On the 5th day, Cordelia corrected her rhythm for the first time. Briar was humming the middle phrase when Cordelia gave a slight shake of her head, slower, and her hand tapped more slowly, forcing Briar to follow. Briar understood. She eased the tempo, and suddenly the melody opened into something different, with more room inside it, more breath. Cordelia nodded, a nod so slight it was almost invisible, but Briar saw it. On the 6th day, she began to teach. Not formally, not with theory. She only spoke in short sentences between the pauses. That note is higher. Hold your breath here. Don't rush. Let the note fall on its own. Her voice was still rough, still weak. But every time she opened her mouth to speak about music, something lit in her eyes that Briar had never seen there before. Cordelia's hands changed most of all. 4 years in bed, rheumatoid arthritis tightening every finger joint until she could barely hold a glass of water. But music called her hands awake in a way physical therapy never had. At first, it was only the tapping of time. Then she began moving her whole hand, then her wrist, then her arm, tracing the rhythm in the air as if she were conducting an invisible orchestra. Her fingers were still swollen, still bent, but they were moving, and each day they moved more than they had the day before. Between the melodies, they began to talk. Not long or profound conversations, only fragments that fell out between songs. Cordelia told her about the velvet room, about the tiny stage that had room for nothing more than a microphone and a piano, about the smell of cigarette smoke and bourbon mingling in the air, about how hot the spotlight was, so hot that sweat would run down the back of her neck in the middle of a high note. She told Briar about her husband, the man who sat at the corner table every night she sang. He never applauded, she said, and her voice grew softer. Everyone else applauded, shouted, whistled. He just sat there and watched, and when I came down from the stage, he said, "Applause is for strangers, and I love you." She finished that sentence and fell silent. She didn't cry. She was simply quiet. Briar was quiet too. She didn't have the right words to answer with, so she said nothing. But the next day, in the middle of a pause between phrases, she let something slip out before she could stop herself. "No one has ever listened to me sing before." The moment she said it, she realized she had spoken aloud something she had never told another living soul. It wasn't self-pity. It was only the truth, plain and bare, like the white pills scattered across the floor that day. Cordelia turned her head and looked at her, slowly, then said, "Now you have me." 4 words. Soft, roughened, but steady as steel. Briar felt something draw tight inside her chest. Not pain, but the strange ache of hearing someone tell her for the first time that she wasn't invisible. She nodded, turned back to the melody, and kept singing. But both of them knew there was something left unspoken. If Reed discovered that Briar was spending every morning on the 3rd floor singing to his mother instead of cleaning, she would be dismissed. There was no need to ask. Reed had hired her to clean the house, not to sit with an old woman and keep her company. And Cordelia understood that, perhaps even more clearly than Briar did. She knew her son. So every morning, they watched the time. They began after Briar had finished the kitchen, around 8:30. They ended before noon, when Sully could return at any moment. Every time the sound of a car engine drifted in from the drive, Briar stopped singing in the middle of a note, picked up the cleaning cloth, stood, and by the time anyone opened the bedroom door, she was wiping the windows or straightening Cordelia's pillows. And Cordelia lay still, her eyes turned outward, her face restored to that familiar emptiness, as if nothing had happened at all, as if she were still only a statue lying in the bed on the 3rd floor. Their secret, hidden between humming and silence, between a cleaning cloth and a melody, between 7 in the morning and noon, every day. Reed came home at nearly 11 o'clock that night, just as he did every night. He took off his shoes at the door, tossed his keys onto the console table, loosened his tie as he climbed the stairs. The mansion was dark and silent, with only the hallway lights flicking on one by one as the sensors caught his movement. 2nd floor, turn right, walk the length of the hall to the master bedroom at the end, and like every night for the last 4 years, he stopped outside his mother's room on the 3rd floor. It wasn't a deliberate stop. His feet simply stopped on their own, the way a body remembers a habit long after the mind has stopped noticing it. He stood there for 1 second, sometimes 2, tilting his head slightly toward the closed door, listening. For 4 years, all he had ever heard was silence, a dense hush, a weight of quietude, the silence of a room with a person in it, but no life. He had grown so used to it that he no longer questioned it, no longer worried, no longer felt anything except that same repeated confirmation each night that his mother was still there, still silent, still breathing, still existing in the way he had accepted as normal. But tonight was different. He stopped as he always did, tilted his head as he always did, and heard something he didn't recognize at first. Not a voice, not music, not a groan or the sound of shifting in bed. It was a sigh, soft, long, and relieved, the kind of sigh a person gives after setting down something heavy, or the kind of breath that comes at the end of laughter, when the laughter itself is gone but the lightness is still lingering in the chest. Reed put his hand on the doorknob. The metal was chilly beneath his palm. He held it there for 3 seconds, then 4, his fingers tightening slightly around it. Almost turned it, almost opened the door, then let go, walked away, went to his own room, closed the door, threw his suit jacket onto a chair, and sat on the edge of the bed staring down at the floor. He didn't know what he had just heard, but he knew it wasn't silence. In the days that followed, Reed didn't stop any longer than usual outside his mother's room, didn't ask Sully whether anything unusual had happened, didn't change a single one of his routines. But he began to notice things. Not on purpose. It was only that details he used to pass by without thought now caught in his mind and stayed there. On Tuesday morning, as he passed his mother's room before heading downstairs to the car, he realized the window curtains had been drawn open. Not by Sully, because Sully hadn't gone up to the 3rd floor yet. Not by Briar, because she hadn't arrived yet. Cordelia had opened them herself. For 4 years, the curtains in her room had only been parted by a narrow crack, enough to let light in, but not enough to be called welcoming. For 4 years he had walked past that same slit in the curtains, narrow and fixed, like a crack in a wall no one cared enough to repair. Today the curtains were wide open, morning sunlight pouring into the room, and he saw the shadow of his mother in bed, not lying with her face turned toward the wall, but propped against her pillows, her face turned toward the window. He kept walking. He didn't stop, but the image stayed with him. On Thursday, Sully gave a brief report in the car on the way to a meeting. The antidepressants are running out more slowly this time than usual. Reed looked out the tinted car window and said nothing. On Saturday, he came home earlier than usual, around 9 in the evening, and saw the white porcelain vase on the console table in the front hall, the same vase he had seen standing empty for 4 years, now holding 3 yellow chrysanthemums and a few sprigs of white baby's breath. They weren't expensive flowers. They hadn't come from a florist. Market flowers, wrapped in newspaper, arranged a little crookedly, but fresh. He looked at the vase longer than he needed to, then called for Sully. Who put the flowers there? Briar. She bought them with her own money and brought them this morning. Reed didn't say anything else. He went to his study, poured himself a whiskey, sat down in the leather chair behind his desk, and turned the glass slowly in his hand. The small pieces began turning in his mind with the amber liquor, the relieved sigh, the open curtains, the antidepressants running out more slowly, yellow chrysanthemums in a white porcelain vase, the housemaid buying flowers with her own money. He opened the desk drawer, the one on the right that he always kept locked. Inside was a single photograph, placed face down. He turned it over. Cordelia Mays on the stage at the Velvet Room, sometime around 72 or 73, he couldn't remember exactly. In the photograph, his mother stood before the microphone, her eyes closed, her mouth open in the middle of a high note, golden light falling over her black hair like a halo. She was so beautiful, the photograph almost seemed to make sound. Reed stared at it for a long time, his thumb brushing lightly over the worn edge. Then he turned it face down again, slid it back into the drawer, and locked it. He sat there in the chair, turning the whiskey in his hand, looking out the window at the bright spread of Chicago below. And for the first time in 4 years, Reed Calloway asked himself a question he had avoided since the day his father fell in front of their gate. Was his mother truly living, or was she only waiting to die? The deal collapsed at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The people across the table pulled out without warning, $2 million left hanging in the air, and the middleman Reed had trusted turned out to be playing both sides. Sully sat behind the wheel, watching the rearview mirror, waiting for instructions. Reed sat in the back seat, his tie already off, twisted in his hand like a length of rope. "Cancel the rest of the meetings. We're going home." Sully didn't ask another question. He started the engine and drove through downtown Chicago under the hard noon sun. They reached the mansion a little before 2, 5 hours earlier than usual. Sully parked at the gate and shut off the engine. Reed stepped out, but instead of going through the front door the way he always did, he circled around to the back, not for any clear reason. It was instinct. The kind of instinct the underworld had carved into his bones over the years. Always use the door people won't expect. Always arrive without warning. The back door opened with a code. No bell, no sound. He slipped off his shoes at the step and entered the house in his socks across the marble floor without a whisper. The kitchen was empty, spotless, the scent of the morning meal long gone. The living room was empty. The whole first floor was silent. He climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the wooden rail, past the second floor, then up toward the third. And halfway up the staircase between the second and third floors, he heard it. At first he thought he had imagined it, thought it was the wind slipping through a crack in a window, or pipes shuddering inside the walls. But it wasn't. It was a human voice. 2 human voices. One young and light, carrying the melody, the notes moving with the steady ease of a stream that knew its own course. And another voice behind it, following the melody without quite catching it, trembling, frail, losing the rhythm in places, falling away and then beginning again. An old voice, the voice of someone who hadn't sung in a very long time and was trying to remember how. Reed stopped in the middle of the staircase. His hand closed so tightly around the railing that the wood pressed into the bones of his fingers. His heart, the same heart that had kept a steady beat through hundreds of deadly negotiations, through dozens of moments with a gun pointed at his face when he hadn't even blinked, that heart missed a beat. He recognized the second voice, his mother. Cordelia Calloway was singing. 4 years. He hadn't heard his mother sing in 4 years. 4 years since the night she stood on the third floor looking down into the front drive and saw her husband fall. 4 years since she closed her mouth and never truly opened it again. 4 years of silence that he had grown used to calling normal. And now that voice was drifting down the staircase, fragile as a thread, trembling like a candle flame in the wind. But there, real, alive, he climbed the last steps without feeling his feet touch the floor, as though he were floating instead of walking. The hallway on the third floor. Cordelia's bedroom door stood slightly open, wide enough for him to look inside without pushing it farther. Briar sat in the chair beside the bed, her back straight, her eyes closed, both hands resting on her lap. She was humming, a nameless melody he didn't recognize, simple and low and sad, but with something warm moving beneath it like glowing coals under ash. And Cordelia, his mother, lay propped against the pillows, her face turned toward Briar. Both of her hands were lifted off the bedspread, her fingers gnarled and reddened with arthritis, rising and dipping through the air, tapping an invisible rhythm, tracing the curve of the melody as if she were conducting an orchestra, only she could see. And her mouth was moving, not speaking, singing. The sound caught low in her throat, the notes not yet emerging clearly into the room but snagging somewhere between her voice and her lips, like a stream trying to break through 4 years of ice. But it was moving. It was trying to move. Reed stood outside the door and looked through the narrow opening. And what rose in his chest wasn't anger. He wanted it to be anger, because anger was something he knew how to handle, Anger had direction, a target, someone to blame. But it wasn't anger. It was recognition. Slow, painful recognition. Like a light being switched on in a room he had thought he knew, only to discover he had never really seen it at all. His mother hadn't been dying from arthritis. She hadn't been dying from depression. She hadn't been dying from a lack of doctors or medicine or money. She had been dying from the void of connection. And he, Reed Calloway, the man who controlled half of Chicago's underworld, the man who could buy almost anything and destroy almost anyone, had been the one standing outside this door every night for 4 years, listening to that silence, nodding to himself, and walking away. He had been the one who let that silence go on, until it had nearly killed his mother. A housemaid with $47 in her bag and a fading bruise on her face had seen what he, her son, had failed to see, or refused to see. Reed leaned back against the hallway wall, tilted his head upward, and closed his eyes. Inside the room, the melody went on, Briar's voice leading, Cordelia's voice following, 2 small streams moving toward the same place. He stood there listening, and for the first time in a very long while, he felt small. Reed pushed the door open. Not hard, not slowly, only enough for the door to swing wider and let the hallway light spill into the room. The melody died at once, like a candle blown out. Briar opened her eyes, turned her head, and went still. Her whole body locked on the chair, her back rigid, her hands clenched tight on her lap, her face draining of color in a single second. She knew she was finished. She knew how this ended because she had lived through this script too many times, in too many houses, with too many different faces, and always the same result. She had done something wrong. She would be sent away. She would leave. On the bed, Cordelia's smile vanished. So quickly it was as though it had never been there at all. Her hands dropped to the coverlet, the fingers that had been moving with the music now lying still. She looked at her son standing in the doorway, and something in her eyes drew inward, like a snail pulling back into its shell at the touch of danger. Reed looked at Briar, looked at his mother, looked at the chair Briar was sitting in, the chair he knew no one had sat in for 4 years because no one had stayed long enough. Looked at the record player on the table by the window, the vinyl still resting on the turntable, the name Cordelia Mays facing the ceiling. He drew in one long, slow breath, the way he always did before stepping into negotiations that decided whether people lived or died. Then he did the one thing neither Briar nor Cordelia expected. He pulled over the other chair from the corner of the room, the gray velvet one coated in dust because no one had touched it in 4 years, dragged it beside the bed across from Briar, and sat down. He didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't give an order. He sat. He looked at his mother, truly looked at her. Not the quick glance through the cracked door each night, not the brief look into the room before turning away because confirming she was still breathing had always seemed enough. He looked at her as if for the first time. White hair spread across the pillow, a face thinner than he remembered. Sharp cheekbones, skin so fine he could see the blue veins beneath her temples. But her eyes, they weren't the eyes of a woman who was dying. Those eyes had just been bright. They had just smiled. They had just sung, before he walked in and everything stopped. "You were singing, Mom." He said it in a low voice, not as a question but as a statement, and his voice trembled on the last word though he tried to hold it steady. Cordelia looked at her son. Silence stretched between them for several seconds. Then she spoke, slowly, each word clear as if she had been holding them in her chest for 4 long years, and only now was letting them out. "For 4 years I heard your footsteps stop outside my door, and then walk away. Every night." Reed didn't answer at once. His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped at his temple. For 4 years, she had heard him every night. For 4 years, she had known he was there, right outside the door, only 1 step away, and every time he had chosen to leave instead of come in. "I thought you already had everything." The words sounded foolish the moment they left his mouth, but they were true. The truth he had repeated to himself for 4 years, so he wouldn't have to face the question that frightened him more than any gun ever had. Cordelia looked at him, and this time she didn't turn away. "I had everything except you." 5 words. Soft, roughened, but each one landed like a hammer. Reed bowed his head, both elbows braced on his knees, both hands locked together, his forehead nearly touching his fingers. The posture of a man bearing something heavier than any deal he had ever handled. Silence filled the room, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of 4 years of footsteps, pausing and retreating. 4 years of breakfast trays returned untouched. 4 years of curtains opened only a crack. 4 years of silence both of them had heard, and neither of them had broken. Reed lifted his head and turned toward Briar. She was still sitting motionless in the chair, hands clenched tight, eyes on the floor, waiting to be dismissed. "How did you do it?" Briar looked up at him. There wasn't fear in her eyes, not the fear he had expected to find. There was only the weariness of someone long used to being asked the wrong question. "I didn't do anything. I just didn't leave." Reed looked at her for a few more seconds, then nodded slowly, as if that answer had just explained everything he had failed to understand for the last 4 years. He drew in a breath, let it out, and said, "Stay. Not to clean. Keep doing exactly what you're doing. Stay with my mother. Double your pay. Set your own schedule. I'll handle separate medical support." Briar didn't nod right away. She looked at him for a long moment, and Reed saw something in her eyes he hadn't expected. Not gratitude, not relief, but fear. A different kind of fear, the fear of someone who had held on to something only to have it torn from her hands too many times. She spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. "If she wants to stop, then it stops. No one forces anything. And if one day I need to go, I go. No one keeps anyone." Reed heard that and understood she wasn't only talking about Cordelia. She was talking about herself. "Don't cage me." That was what she was really saying, in the language of someone who had been trapped too many times in too many houses that belonged to other people. He nodded. "Deal." The two of them held each other's gaze for one more second, then both turned toward the bed at the sound of Cordelia's voice. She had stayed silent through their exchange, lying there listening, her eyes moving from her son to Briar and back to her son again. But now she spoke, and her voice was no longer hoarse or weak. It was clear, steady. It carried the tone of the woman who had once stood before the microphone at the Velvet Room and made an entire room hold its breath. "The girl stays. That's my decision. 4 years. For 4 years, Cordelia Calloway had made no decisions, demanded nothing, spoken almost nothing except a few monosyllables and long stretches of silence. Now she gave an order, and her voice, when she said it, wasn't the voice of a patient. It wasn't the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a woman taking back control, little by little, beginning with one small command in a third-floor bedroom. Reed looked at his mother, and the corner of his mouth moved slightly. Almost a smile. Almost. That night, after Briar had left the mansion and Cordelia had gone to sleep, Reed sat in his study on the first floor with the door closed, the desk lamp on, and a glass of whiskey untouched beside his elbow. He called Sully in. Sully stood in front of the desk with his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. Reed didn't look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the dark wood surface of the desk as he spoke in a clipped voice. "Investigate Briar Ashford. Everything. Background, history, family, finances, any record if there is one. 48 hours. Sully nodded and turned to go. He didn't ask why. Didn't ask how far to take it. 48 hours later, at 10 o'clock that night, Sully laid a yellow envelope on Reed's desk. It wasn't thick, only around 10 pages, but it was enough. Reed opened the envelope, pulled out the papers, and began to read. Briar Ashford, born March 12th, 27 years old. Mother deceased when Briar was 4, cause of death, overdose. Father unknown, line left blank on the birth certificate. She was placed into the Illinois foster care system immediately after her mother died. 7 foster homes in 14 years. Reed read down the list, one line for each family: name, address, length of stay, reason for removal. First family, 11 months, financial hardship. Second family, 8 months, not a good fit. Third family, 2 years, returned after child was hospitalized. Reed stopped on that line. Hospitalized. She was 9. 2 broken ribs on the left side. Hospital record listed the cause as a fall down the stairs. Reed had spent too many years in the underworld not to know what a fall down the stairs usually meant when the victim was a 9-year-old child in a stranger's house. He kept reading. Fourth family, 1.5 years. Fifth family, 10 months. Child hospitalized a second time. 12 years old. Burn injury to the right hand, 2nd degree. Cause listed in the record as a kitchen accident. Reed looked at the words kitchen accident and thought of Briar's hands. Rough, calloused, the hands he had seen gathering the scattered pills from the floor of his mother's room with that strange carefulness, as though she were used to picking up sharp things without cutting herself. Now he knew why. 6th family. 7th family. At 16, aged out of the foster care system. No one adopted her. No one kept her. The next page. Employment history. Scattered and unstable. Bar server, restaurant dishwasher, hotel floor cleaner, motel housekeeper. No degree. No certification. No bank account. Only a small savings account at a local bank with a zero balance. Emergency contact line on every job application, every hospital form, every rental paper, all left blank. Not one name, not one phone number, not a single person in the world she could call if she needed help. Final page. Restraining order against Deacon Marsh. Issued 2 years earlier. Valid for 1 year. Now expired. Not renewed. Reason for request? Facial injury. Left cheekbone. Hospitalized at 24 years old. Cause? Domestic violence. Reed finished the last page, set the papers down on the desk, and leaned back in his chair. His face gave nothing away. Anyone who didn't know him would have thought he was calm, processing information the same way he processed every other file among the hundreds Sully brought him each month. But his right hand was gripping the edge of the desk, fingers clenched so tightly the knuckles had gone white, and he held that position for a long time. He remembered what Briar had said in his mother's room on the first day, the sentence whose full weight he hadn't understood then. I know what it feels like to want to smash everything. Now he understood, not with reason alone, but with something deeper, something he wasn't used to naming. She had recognized his mother's loneliness, not because she was gifted, not because she was sharper than 6 nurses and 3 doctors. She had recognized it because she had lived inside it, her whole life, from the age of 4 to the age of 27, 23 years in the dark with no one to pull her out, and somehow she still got up every morning, still rang the bell at strangers' houses, still bent to pick medicine off the floor for an old woman she didn't know, still sang in hallways because it was the only way she knew to stay alive. Reed let go of the desk, reached for the whiskey, and took a long drink. Then he set the glass down. Call Sully. Deacon Marsh. Full name, current address, workplace, vehicle, routines, everything. Put him under watch. If he comes near her, Reed didn't finish the sentence. Sully stood in the doorway, looked at him, and nodded. He understood. In their world, the unfinished sentences usually carried more weight than the ones spoken all the way through. 3 months passed, and not a single piece of furniture in the Calloway mansion changed. The black marble floors were still there. The crystal chandeliers were still there. The charcoal leather furniture was still there. But anyone who stepped inside could feel that something was different. Something that couldn't be seen but could be heard, couldn't be touched but could be felt. Every morning, the sound of humming drifted down from the 3rd floor. 2 voices woven together, one young and one old. The melody sometimes slow, sometimes quick, sometimes stopping halfway through, only to begin again from the start, with a quiet voice correcting the rhythm, adjusting the pitch. The music wasn't loud, only just enough for someone standing at the bottom of the stairs to hear if they listened for it. But it changed the air of the whole house, as though someone had opened a window no one had realized had been shut for 4 years. Cordelia ate better. Not all at once, but gradually, 1 meal at a time. In the first week after Reed found out, she began finishing half a tray, instead of only taking 1 bite of toast. In the 2nd week, she asked for salt. Sully brought the salt upstairs. She tasted the oatmeal, frowned, and said it was bland. In the 3rd week, she told Briar to cook for her instead of eating what Sully had prepared ahead of time. Briar made chicken porridge. Cordelia tasted it, said it was bland, made her season it again, tasted it a 2nd time, nodded, and ate nearly the whole bowl. By the 4th week, she started making specific requests. Today, make butternut squash soup. Don't use too much cream. Add a little nutmeg. Briar didn't know how to make butternut squash soup, but she found a way. She asked Sully to buy the ingredients, worked out a recipe on her own, made it wrong the 1st time, made it again the 2nd, and brought it upstairs. Cordelia ate it and didn't complain, which was the highest praise she had ever given. Cordelia's hand still hurt. Arthritis didn't disappear because of music. Every morning when she woke, the joints in her fingers were still stiff, still swollen, still needed 15 slow minutes of massage before they could move. But she moved them more. Tapping the rhythm against the side of the bed had become a habit, And then from tapping, she began drawing in the air, her whole arm rising and dipping with the melody, her wrist turning, her fingers bending, as if she were conducting the music Briar was singing. And then one day, when Briar brought her a glass of water, Cordelia reached out and took it, with both hands. 10 stiff, reddened knuckles wrapped around the glass, trembling, but holding. Briar didn't say a word. She only let go and watched Cordelia drink water with her own hands for the first time in a very long while. Reed began coming home earlier. Not every day, but often enough that Briar noticed. At first, he only stood outside the bedroom door listening, the way he had every night before, except now it was in the late afternoon while the singing was still going on. Then, little by little, he began coming in, pulling over the gray velvet chair, sitting down, and listening in silence until the melody ended. One evening, Cordelia didn't sing. She told a story instead. She looked at Reed and said, "Do you remember the piano in the old house? The Steinway your father bought from a jazz club that had closed down?" Reed nodded. Cordelia went on, her voice slow but her eyes bright. "You used to hide underneath that piano every time there was thunder. Tiny thing, curled up under the pedals with both hands over your ears. Your father had to crawl down and pull you out, every single time." Reed looked at his mother, and the corner of his mouth curved. "Not much, only enough. I remember the smell of the wood. Under the piano it smelled like wood and furniture polish." Cordelia nodded. "You would lie under there, and I would sit on the piano bench. I didn't play, but I sat there and sang until you stopped covering your ears." Briar was sitting in the chair by the window, slightly farther back, listening. She smiled a little as she pictured Reed Calloway, Mafia kingpin, curled up under a piano with his hands over his ears because he was afraid of thunder. And at that exact moment, all three of them laughed together. Not loudly, not wildly. Reed only let out a soft breath through his nose with the faintest huff of sound. Cordelia laughed hoarsely in her throat. Briar laughed with her eyes narrowing a little at the corners. 3 small laughs in a bedroom on the 3rd floor, but it was the first time in 4 years that the mansion had heard more than one person laughing at once. When the laughter faded, Briar stood and stepped back toward the door. She was used to that, used to the edge, used to withdrawing when a moment became too warm, because she had learned that warmth never lasted, and leaving before being sent away always hurt less. But Cordelia looked at her and said, her voice not loud but clear, "Sit down. You're part of this family too." Briar stopped in the doorway, looked at Cordelia, looked at Reed. Reed didn't say anything, but he didn't tell her to leave. She turned back and sat down again, though her back was still ramrod straight, both hands on her lap, both feet flat on the floor, ready to rise at any moment. The posture of someone who still didn't believe she was truly allowed to stay. Cordelia looked at her and understood. She didn't say anything more, didn't press. Instead, she said something else. "Your voice has color." Briar blinked. "I've listened to you sing every morning for months now," Cordelia went on. "You sing by instinct, but you don't know how to use your breath. Breathe from your belly, not your chest. Open your throat, don't tighten it. Let the note come out on its own, don't push." She spoke the way a teacher speaks, and her eyes, whenever she talked about music, lit up in a way no medicine could ever create. "Your voice has color," she said again. "It only needs someone to teach you how to use it." On Saturday morning, Briar went to the market earlier than usual. It was a new habit she had made for herself over the past 3 months. Every weekend, she used her own money to buy a small bouquet and bring it back to place in the white porcelain vase in the front hall. No one had asked her to do it. No one was paying her for it. She had simply seen the vase standing empty and wanted there to be something inside it, the same way she wanted this house to hold something besides silence. Today she chose white chrysanthemums and a few sprigs of lavender, wrapped in newspaper, priced at $3.50. She paid, took the flowers, turned to head back toward the mansion, and stopped. At the far end of the street, across the road, a gray pickup truck was parked. The paint was peeling on the driver's side door. The right side mirror was cracked and held together with black tape, Illinois plates. She recognized that truck before she recognized anything else, because her body remembered it before her mind had time to catch up. Her heart missed a beat, then started pounding twice as fast. Her hand clenched around the flowers until the newspaper crumpled. One leg wanted to run, but the other wanted to root itself into the sidewalk. "Deacon," She couldn't see him inside the truck. The windows were dark, and the sunlight was hitting at the wrong angle, but she didn't need to see him. She knew that truck the way she knew the scars on her own body, each one tied to a night she wanted to forget, but her bones refused to let go of. She dropped the bouquet on the sidewalk and ran. She didn't look back, didn't check whether he was following her, only ran, pure instinct, with the legs that 23 years of survival had taught that when danger appears, you run first and think later. She ran all the way to the mansion, punched in the gate code, her hand shaking so badly she had to do it twice, slipped inside, shut the gate, ran across the drive, through the back door, and locked it behind her. She stood in the kitchen with her back pressed to the door, breathing hard, her chest aching. Sully was in the kitchen making coffee. He looked at her and frowned. Briar shook her head, said, "I'm fine," then went upstairs to the servants' room on the second floor and shut the door. She wasn't fine. That afternoon, the house phone rang. Sully picked up. On the other end was a man's voice, a little thick, a little slurred, the voice of someone drinking or freshly drunk. "Tell the brown-haired girl I know where she is." Sully didn't answer. He held the line for 3 more seconds, noting every sound in the background, traffic, faint country music from a radio, wind, then hung up. He logged the call, the time, the content, the quality of the voice, and sent it to Reed within 10 minutes. That night, Briar didn't sleep. She sat in the corner of her room on the floor with her back against the wall, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around her shins. The light was off. The darkness surrounded her like an old blanket she hated, but couldn't throw away. She knew this position well. She had sat like this through hundreds of nights, in dozens of rooms, in dozens of houses that were never hers. A defensive posture, making her body smaller, reducing the amount of herself exposed to the world, becoming the smallest target possible. She thought about leaving. Thought about it specifically, packing her bag, slipping out before dawn, catching a bus to any other city, starting over the way she had done so many times before. Every time she began to have something, a job, a room, a person, it was torn away from her. Always. She had grown so used to it that part of her almost wanted it to happen quickly, just to get it over with, because waiting for loss was always worse than the loss itself. But there in the dark, she thought of Cordelia, thought of tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, the 3rd floor, the bedroom door standing slightly open, and the old woman waiting. Not waiting for someone to clean the room or bring her medicine, waiting for Briar, waiting for the nameless melody that had now become a melody shared by the two of them. If she left, tomorrow morning would be silent, and Cordelia had already suffered enough silence. Briar didn't get up to pack her bag. She stayed in the corner of the room until morning. At 7 o'clock, Reed called her into his study. He was seated behind the desk, with Sully standing by the door. Reed looked at her and didn't waste words. "Who was the man who called yesterday?" Briar stood in front of the desk with her arms at her sides, her eyes straight ahead. Silence for 3 seconds. Then she spoke, her voice flat, as if she were reading a line from her own file. "I don't belong to anyone." It didn't answer Reed's question, not directly, but it answered the larger one, the one she had carried with her for 23 years. "I don't belong to anyone. No one comes looking for me because they want me. They come because they want to own me, control me, break me. I don't belong to anyone." Reed looked at her. For a long time, then he spoke, his voice low, just enough to fill the distance between the desk and where she stood. "You do now." Briar didn't answer. She stood there looking at him, and inside her chest, 2 things were pulling in opposite directions. One part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to believe with a desperation that frightened her, that the words were true, that this time was different, that this house was different, that this man was different. The other part, the part that had been beaten, abandoned, returned, the part that had suffered broken ribs at 9 and a burned hand at 12, that part told her not to believe, because every time she believed, she bled. She didn't know which part would win. She only knew that this was the first time anyone had ever said those words to her, while their eyes told the truth. After that morning in the study, Reed didn't bring up Deacon again. He didn't ask more questions, didn't press Briar to explain, didn't offer any promise beyond the 4 words he had already given her. But what changed was the way he looked at her. It wasn't a dramatic change, wasn't sudden, only small moments that he once would have passed over and now his eyes stayed on. One afternoon he came home early, walked past the second-floor balcony, and saw Briar kneeling on the third-floor balcony above, gathering dry leaves from the gutter and dropping them into a trash bag. That balcony was where Cordelia sometimes sat on warm days, leaning against Briar and looking out over the garden. Briar was clearing the leaves, so the next time Cordelia came out to sit there, the floor would be clean and the wind wouldn't blow dead leaves into her face. No one had told her to do it. No one was paying her extra for it. She simply did it because she was thinking of Cordelia. Reed stood on the second-floor balcony looking up, looking at her thin back bent over as she picked up each leaf one by one, and he remembered the 10-page file in the yellow envelope, remembered the emergency contact box left blank, and wondered how a person who had no one in the world could care for someone else with such quiet attention to detail, and where she had learned that kind of care. On another morning, he passed his mother's room while Briar was singing. He stopped in the hallway and listened without going in, and he realized her voice trembled in one place. Not because she missed the note, but because she was feeling too much. The kind of tremor that comes when a person is singing something too close to an old wound for the throat to hide it. Cordelia was tapping the rhythm against the side of the bed, more slowly than usual, as though she heard that crack in Briar's voice too, and was adjusting the tempo to give her room. Reed walked away before the melody ended, but that tremor followed him down the stairs, into the car, and all the way to his afternoon meeting. Then one night he came home late, went into the kitchen for water, and found Briar washing dishes. She had pushed her sleeves up to her elbows, both hands sunk in hot soapy water, and under the kitchen light he saw them. The scars, faded, old, but unmistakable beneath the white light. On her left wrist were 2 short parallel marks, not self-inflicted, but the kind left by someone gripping too hard and twisting. On her right forearm was a longer scar, a burn scar, the skin puckered and shiny, the place where her hand had been burned at 12. The injury the file had called a kitchen accident. Briar realized he was looking and pulled her sleeve down at once, a quick, decisive movement of someone long practiced in hiding. She didn't look at him. She kept washing the dishes, and Reed said nothing, poured his water, drank it, and left the kitchen. But after that night, he began doing small things. The next morning, when Briar came downstairs at 6:45, there was a cup of hot coffee on the table. She looked at the cup, then around the kitchen, but no one was there. She didn't know that Reed had gotten up at 5, made the coffee, left it on the table, then gone back upstairs before she came down. The next day it happened again, and the day after that, a hot cup of coffee on the kitchen table every morning, with no explanation, no note, simply there. Briar drank it without asking, and that became the first silent conversation between them, one both of them understood without needing to speak. Then the weather turned cold. Chicago in November, with wind off Lake Michigan cutting through the city like a blade. Briar still wore the thrift store coat she had brought with her on the first day, thin, worn through at the elbows, the zipper snagging halfway up. Reed saw her in that coat every morning when she arrived and every evening when she left, and one day he told Sully to buy a winter coat. He didn't give a size, only said to look at her and estimate. Sully came back with a black down coat, warm, neat, not designer, but good, and set it on the chair in the front hall where Briar would see it when she left. Briar saw the coat, picked it up, looked at it, then folded it and set it on the console table beside the flower vase, and the next morning carried it into Reed's study while he was sitting there reading reports. She set the coat on the desk. Reed looked up. Briar said, her voice calm though her eyes were not calm at all, "I don't know what the price of this is." Reed looked at her and understood immediately that she wasn't talking about money. She wasn't asking how many dollars the coat cost. She was asking what she would have to pay, what she would have to endure, what debt would be attached to it. Because in the world she had lived in, nobody gave anything for free. Deacon gave her a place to stay, and she paid with a broken cheekbone. Foster care gave her a roof, and she paid with broken ribs at 9. Everything she was given had a price, and the price was always collected in flesh. Reed set the report down, stood, picked up the coat, and placed it on the chair by the door. "There's no price. It's cold. You need a coat." Then he sat back down, picked up the report, and kept reading as though the matter were finished. Briar stood there for a few more seconds, then turned and walked out without taking the coat. That night in the servants' room, she lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, and thinking about the coat lying on the chair in the study downstairs. She thought about it for a long time. The next morning, when she came down to the kitchen, She saw that someone had brought the coat upstairs and hung it on the hook outside her room. She looked at it, stood there for 10 seconds, then took it down, put it on, and pulled the zipper all the way up to her chin. Warm. It fit. On the third-floor balcony, Cordelia sat propped against pillows in the chair Briar always set out for her on fair days. She looked down toward the front drive and saw Briar stepping out through the gate in the new coat, just as Reed came out the front door and walked toward Sully's idling car. The two of them didn't look at each other, didn't say a word, walked in opposite directions. But Briar was wearing the coat, and Cordelia smiled. A small smile. A slow one. The first smile she had given that wasn't because someone had told her a story or sung for her, but because she was seeing something that her two foolish children still couldn't yet see in themselves. That night, Briar woke a little before 1 a.m, her mouth dry, her eyes stinging because she had fallen asleep without turning off the bedside lamp. She went downstairs to get water, barefoot on the cold stone floor, one hand trailing along the wall through the dark. She made it to the bottom of the stairs, turned into the hallway leading to the kitchen, and stopped. Reed was standing in the middle of the hall with his back to her. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was gone, his hair slightly disheveled, and his phone pressed to his ear. He spoke into it in a low, measured voice, each word clear as if he were carving it into stone. "Tell him next time there won't be a next time." Silence. Whoever was on the other end said something. Reed answered, his voice never rising, but so unfeeling that Briar felt the temperature in the hallway drop. "I don't repeat myself." Then he hung up, and when he turned and walked toward the kitchen, the motion sensor lights in the hall flicked on, and Briar saw it. The right cuff of his white dress shirt, from elbow to wrist, had blood on it. Not much, not the kind of stain that came from a large wound, only a dark red smear across white fabric, but enough to stand out under the light. Blood. On the arm of a man who had just spoken into a phone in a tone Briar had heard too many times in her life. The tone of a man who had the power to hurt other people and knew it. She froze. Her whole body locked in less than a second. The reflex that 23 years of survival had welded into her nervous system. Her eyes fixed on the blood on the shirt cuff, and her mind didn't see Reed Calloway. Her mind saw Deacon. Different face, different voice, different everything on the outside, but the same energy. The energy of a man walking into a house late at night, with traces of violence on him, and not 1 ounce of regret in his voice. She had lived with that energy for 3 years. She knew what it smelled like, what it tasted like, what it felt like when it turned toward her. Reed hadn't seen her yet. He turned into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator for water. Briar stepped back, her bare feet soundless on the stone, went up the stairs, into her room, locked the door. She sat with her back against the wall, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around her shins. Her heart pounded like a drum. The old position, the defensive one, the posture she had thought she left behind in the miserable apartment where she hid from Deacon, only to realize it was still there inside her body, waiting to be called back. She didn't sleep again that night. The next morning she arrived at exactly 7, cleaned the kitchen, prepared the food, wiped down the first floor, wiped down the second. She didn't go up to the 3rd floor. She didn't sing. Sully watched her move through the hallway with her cloth and bottle of glass spray, her face ordinary, but her eyes different. The eyes of someone drawing inward again, retreating from everything she had once begun to open. He didn't ask. Upstairs on the 3rd floor, Cordelia waited. 8:30, 9, 9:30. No footsteps on the stairs, no humming in the hallway, no soft knock on the half-open door before someone stepped inside. She lay in bed with her eyes turned toward the door instead of the window, waiting. By 10, she turned her face to the wall. The second day was the same as the first. Briar came, cleaned, stayed silent, didn't go to the 3rd floor, and left. Cordelia waited until 10, then turned toward the wall. On the 3rd day, Briar stood at the foot of the stairs and looked up toward the 3rd floor and almost went up. Her left foot had already stepped onto the first stair, but then she closed her eyes and saw the blood on the white shirt cuff, heard that cold voice in the dark hallway, and pulled her foot back. She finished the 2nd floor, gathered her things, put on the coat Reed had bought her, and stood at the back door looking out into the yard. She was considering it, truly considering it, not in the empty way people think about leaving, but in the way of counting money in her head, calculating whether she had enough for a bus ticket to somewhere else, how long it would take to find work in another city. Then she heard it. From the 3rd floor, faint, drifting down through 2 flights of stairs. Her name, Briar. Cordelia's voice. Hoarse, thin, like a thread about to snap. She didn't know what had happened. She didn't know about the blood, or the phone call, or Briar curled up in the dark. She only knew that for 3 mornings no one had come to sing. For 3 mornings her room had gone silent again, in the same way she once thought she would never escape. And she was calling the name of the only girl who hadn't walked away from her. Briar stood at the back door with one hand gripping the strap of her bag, listening to her own name fall down from the 3rd floor. She closed her eyes. Tears slid down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She set the bag down, took off her coat and hung it on the hook, and stayed. The next morning, while Briar was wiping down the kitchen table, Reed walked in. He was wearing a dark blue shirt, the cuffs clean, no blood. He looked at her and knew at once that something was wrong. 3 days she hadn't gone upstairs to the 3rd floor. 3 days his mother had turned her face to the wall. 3 days the house had lost the sound he had only just begun to grow used to. What's wrong? Briar didn't look at his face. She looked at his shirt cuff, the dark blue fabric, clean, then lifted her eyes and looked straight into his and asked, "Who are you, really?" Her voice was calm, but her eyes were not. In those eyes, Reed saw something he hadn't expected. Not fear, a question. The question of someone standing on the edge between staying and leaving, between trust and distrust, between opening and shutting down again. She didn't ask him what he did for a living. She didn't ask whose blood had been on his cuff. She asked the only thing that mattered. "Are you like him? Are you the kind of man who would use that hand on me?" Reed looked at her, and for the first time in his life, the man who controlled half of Chicago's underworld, the man who had never lacked an answer to any question put before him, had no answer to give. Reed didn't answer Briar's question that morning. She turned away, went up to the 3rd floor, and for the first time after 3 days of silence, the sound of humming rose again from Cordelia's room, but her voice was different, softer, more guarded, like someone singing with one hand still resting on the doorknob, ready to leave. Reed heard it from the 2nd floor hallway, then went down to his study, closed the door, and sat in his chair. Her question still hung in the air of the room. "Who are you, really?" He looked down at his 2 hands, the hands that had given orders, made threats, grabbed other men by the collar in the dark, and he asked himself a question he had never had to ask before, because in his world no one ever asked it. 3 days passed. Briar went up to the 3rd floor every morning, but her singing stayed thin, still holding itself at a distance, and she didn't look into Reed's eyes when she passed him in the hall. Then, on the 4th afternoon, close to 6 o'clock, when the last light of day was draining from the Chicago sky, and the wind off Lake Michigan was blowing cold through the trees in front of the mansion, Sully called Reed through the security feed at the gate. "Someone's here." Reed looked at the screen. The gray pickup truck was parked right outside the gate, the door hanging open, a man standing beside it, tall, broad-shouldered, dirty brown hair, a denim jacket torn at the elbows, his stance just slightly off balance. Drunk, Deacon Marsh slammed his hand against the iron gate, the metal shuddering through the quiet evening air. Then he shouted, "Briar." Her name came out of his mouth like a dog's bark, vicious and possessive. "Briar, I know you're in there. Come out here." Sully had already gone to the gate, standing just inside it, hands clasped behind his back, but his shoulders open, the stance of a man already prepared. Reed stepped out the front door and crossed the drive toward the gate. He hadn't made it there yet when he heard footsteps behind him. Quick, light, deliberate. He turned. Briar was standing behind him. Her face was white, her lips pressed tight, her hands clenched at her sides, but her eyes weren't lowered. Her eyes were fixed straight past his shoulder, toward the gate, toward the gray pickup and the man beating his hand against the iron bars. "Let me." 2 words. Her voice was small, but not a whisper. The voice of someone shaking inside but refusing to let that shaking decide for her. Reed looked at her. He saw in her eyes something he recognized because he had seen it in the mirror himself. Fear being held down by sheer will. He wanted to say no, wanted to tell her to go back inside, wanted to handle this the way he knew how. Fast, clean, with no one forced to witness it. But she had already stepped past him and was walking toward the gate, and he understood that this wasn't his. It was hers. Briar stopped 3 steps from the gate. Deacon saw her, and he smiled. That smile she had seen hundreds of times. The smile he always wore before everything turned bad. "Baby," he said. his words thick with alcohol. "Come home." Briar looked at him, looked at the face she had once feared so much she couldn't sleep, looked at the hands whose weight she knew all too well, looked at the eyes where she had once searched for love and found only darkness. And she spoke, her voice trembling, but every word clear. "I'm not afraid of you anymore. Go." Deacon stopped smiling. His eyes darkened, his jaw tightened, and he stepped forward, his hand reaching through the bars of the gate, and Reed was there, not beside Briar, between them, directly between them, between Deacon's outstretched hand and the girl standing behind him. He didn't hit him, didn't shout, didn't pull out anything at all. He only stood there, looked at Deacon, and said it in a low, measured voice, each word dropping like a stone. "I'm Reed Calloway. This is my house. She is under my protection. You have 30 seconds to leave this street. And if I see this truck or your face anywhere in this city one more time, there won't be a third chance for you to drive it away." It wasn't the voice of a man speaking in anger. It was the voice of a man stating a fact, plain and absolute, like gravity. Deacon looked at Reed, looked at Sully standing nearby, broad-shouldered, expressionless, looked at the mansion behind them, the iron gate, the security cameras, and something in the eyes of the man standing in front of him that even through the haze of drink he understood wasn't something to test. He stepped back, got into the truck, started the engine, drove away. 24 hours later, Sully confirmed that the gray pickup had left Illinois. Deacon Marsh disappeared from Chicago, and in Reed Calloway's world, disappeared meant disappeared. But what Briar remembered most from that afternoon wasn't Deacon leaving. It wasn't Reed's cold voice or Sully's expression. She remembered the moment Reed stepped in between her and Deacon, between her and the storm she had faced alone for 23 years. He didn't ask whether she wanted him standing there. He simply stood, and that was the answer to the question she had asked him in the kitchen that morning. Who are you, really? He was the man who stepped between her and the storm, not the man who made the storm. That night, after the mansion had gone still, Briar stood behind the window on the second floor and looked down at the front drive. The iron gate was closed. The street was empty. The gray pickup was gone. Tears moved slowly down her face in silence. She wasn't crying because she was afraid. She was crying because for the first time in her life, when the storm came, someone hadn't left her behind. Later that same afternoon, when darkness was beginning to settle over Chicago and the wind off Lake Michigan had finally stopped howling, Reed and Briar went up to the third floor. Neither of them spoke on the stairs. Their footsteps were out of rhythm, Reed 2 steps ahead, Briar behind him, her eyes still red though the tears were gone. They were going up to tell Cordelia that everything was all right, that the noise outside the gate was over, that there was nothing left to fear. Reed put his hand on his mother's doorknob, turned it, pushed the door open, and stopped cold. Cordelia was standing, not sitting propped against pillows in bed, not lying down, standing, both feet on the floor, bare, her toes curled against the cold tile. Her right hand clutched the bedrail, the knuckles white from the force of her grip, her whole arm shaking from wrist to shoulder. Her left hand braced against the bedside table, the table itself shoved a few inches out of place because she had used it as leverage to pull herself upright. Her legs were trembling, not lightly, but so hard that her knees knocked together, her calves jerked, her entire weight thrown onto the 2 arms clinging to the bed and the table. But she was standing. 4 years in bed, 4 years of muscles wasting from disuse, 4 years of arthritis gnawing at her joints until walking had become something that belonged only to memory, and she was standing. Reed couldn't speak. He stood in the doorway, one hand still on the knob, his mouth slightly open but no words coming out. Briar stepped up beside him, looked into the room, and went still too. Cordelia looked at the 2 of them in the doorway, and her eyes weren't the eyes of a patient or a victim or a frail old woman. Her eyes were bright, bright in a fierce way, like a small flame refusing to go out no matter how hard the wind blew. I heard the girl. She said it in a rough voice, her breath broken because all her strength was going into keeping her legs from collapsing. I heard him shouting outside the gate, and I heard her say, "I'm not afraid of you anymore." She stopped, breathed, then turned her eyes to Briar. I had to come down. Briar gave the smallest shake of her head, not in refusal, but in disbelief. Cordelia had heard everything from the 3rd floor, heard Deacon pounding on the gate, heard Briar's voice shaking but not backing down, heard Reed's voice cold as steel. And she, the woman who hadn't left her bed in 4 years, had pulled herself to her feet. No one had helped her. No one had known. She had stood up because the girl whose singing she heard every morning was down there facing the storm, and she couldn't stay lying still. Cordelia let go of the bedside table with one hand, carefully, trembling, and pointed toward the bedroom door. "I want to go downstairs. I can make it to the door." She stepped. 1 step. Left foot. Short, painful, the knee almost refusing to bend, but the foot lifted and came down a few inches ahead. Then the right foot, shorter, shakier, but it came down too. 2 steps, from the bed rail to the middle of the room, then another step, then another. She walked like someone crossing a wire, every movement a struggle between will and gravity, between determination and a body that had given up on her a long time ago. She made it to the doorway, no farther. Her legs buckled on the 5th step, her hand shooting out to catch the doorframe, and she stopped there, breathing hard, sweat beading on her forehead. But she was standing in the doorway. For the first time in 4 years, Cordelia Calloway had left her bed by the force of her own will. "I can still do it," she said it, and her voice when she spoke those words wasn't the weak, hoarse voice Reed had grown used to over the last 4 years. There was steel in it, fire in it, something burning up from inside her that no doctor could have prescribed. Reed stepped forward and stood in front of his mother. He looked at her shaking legs, looked at the hand gripping the doorframe until it went white, looked at the sweat on her brow, and then he said, his voice thick but unbroken, "You always could." Cordelia looked at her son, and the corner of her mouth lifted. Then she turned to Briar, standing beside Reed, tears running silently down her face. Not wiped away, not hidden, just falling. The girl who had stood before her abuser and said, "I'm not afraid of you anymore," was now crying without a sound because she was watching a 78-year-old woman stand up. And then Cordelia did the one thing no one in that room expected. She sang, not hummed. Not the low, caught in the throat sound of those mornings when she and Briar had sung together. She sang for real, opened her mouth, opened her throat, and let the note rise out from the deepest place in her chest, the place she had locked shut for 4 long years. Her voice broke. It broke on the very first note, rough and thin, like an instrument left untouched for years, and suddenly tuned too quickly. But the melody was clear, so clear that Briar knew it at once, even though she had never heard this song before. And Reed knew it at once because he had heard his mother sing it all his life, the song Cordelia had sung the night her husband proposed to her at the Velvet Room, the song he had stood up to hear with tears in his eyes while she smiled through her own tears, and her voice cracked on the high note and became more beautiful for breaking. And now she was singing that song again, standing in the doorway of her room, one hand gripping the frame, her legs shaking, her voice breaking, but singing. Only a few notes, just a few, but they filled the room, spilled into the hallway, flowed down the staircase, and filled the mansion that hadn't heard a single true note in 4 years. Reed Calloway stood in front of his mother and listened to the voice he had thought was dead, and he cried. Tears ran down his face quietly, and he didn't wipe them away, didn't hide them, didn't turn aside. He couldn't remember the last time he had cried. Maybe the night his father fell in front of the gate. Maybe longer ago than that. It didn't matter. He was crying now, standing before his mother, listening to her sing the song she had thought she buried with her husband, and he understood that for 4 years he hadn't been losing her to illness. He had almost lost her to silence, and a girl with $47 in her bag had broken that silence with the only thing she had, her voice. That night, the Calloway mansion sank into a different kind of silence. Not the dead silence, not the heavy quiet, not the stagnation of 4 years, when no one spoke, and no one sang, and no one cried. This was a warm silence, the silence of a house that had just survived a storm and found everything still standing. Cordelia slept in her bed on the 3rd floor, and for the first time in many years, she slept without medicine. Her face was relaxed, not tightened with pain, not drawn shut in defense, only asleep, like someone who had finally laid down something she had carried on her back for far too long. Sully locked the gate, checked the cameras, turned off the lights on the 1st floor, and went up to his room on the 2nd. The mansion dimmed one room at a time, this light going out, and then that one, until only the glow at the back steps remained, where Reed and Briar sat side by side. Reed sat on the left, his elbow resting on his knee, a glass of whiskey in his hand that he didn't drink. Briar sat on the right, both hands on her lap, her back bent slightly forward, her eyes on the dark garden. The wind was cold, but neither of them went inside. They sat there in silence, and this time the silence didn't need breaking. It was enough. It was warm. It was the kind of silence that belongs to two people who have truly seen each other and don't need words to prove it. Reed spoke first, his voice low and slow, not looking at her but out toward the garden. I built everything with power and money. I believed that if I spent enough, every problem would have a solution. Doctors who charged $1,000, nurses who spoke 3 languages, medicine imported from overseas. I poured money into my mother the way I would pour money into a real estate project, thinking that if enough went in, the result would come out. But the thing that pulled my mother out of that bed was the girl I was paying to clean my house. He stopped, turned the whiskey in the glass, watched the liquid circle inside it. Briar didn't look at him. She looked down at her hands resting on her lap and answered softly, I didn't save her. I just didn't leave, because I know what it feels like to be left behind. Silence again. The wind moved through the garden, stirring branches whose names Briar didn't know. Reed set the whiskey down on the step, turned to look at her, and then he said something very softly, softer than almost anything he had ever said in his life, because this was the heaviest sentence of all. Stay. Not for my mother. Briar looked up, looked at him. In his eyes there was none of the coldness she had seen on the first day when he handed her the key and told her to keep everything clean. None of the menace she had seen in the hallway the night there was blood on his cuff. In his eyes was something she recognized because she saw it every day in the mirror, the loneliness of a person who has everything and no one. She didn't answer right away. She lifted her face and looked up at the Chicago sky, the sky she had seen through dozens of windows in dozens of houses that had never been hers, a sky always blurred by city light, never full of stars. But tonight the sky was strangely clear, not crystal clear, not crowded with stars the way it is in films, just less clouded than usual, enough for her to make out a few small points of light that she couldn't tell were stars or planes or satellites, but they were there, high above, and she could see them. I've never had a home. She said it without sadness, without self-pity, only as truth, the same way she had spoken every truth inside this house, plain and unhidden. Now you do. Reed said it, and the words weren't a grand promise, weren't some sweeping declaration, only 3 simple words, spoken low enough that the wind could almost have carried them away. But Briar heard them, and then she did something she had never done in her whole life. She leaned her shoulder lightly against his. Only that. No hand-holding, no embrace, no turning to look at him. She only shifted a few inches to the left, enough for her shoulder to rest against his, enough to feel the warmth of the person beside her through the coat he had bought for her. The smallest act in the world. But for Briar, the girl who had never dared lean on anyone because every time she leaned, she fell. It was everything. Reed didn't move, didn't speak. He only sat there and let her lean, and for the first time in a very long while, he felt his shoulder grow lighter instead of heavier. Then from the 3rd floor, very faintly, drifting down, came the sound of humming. Cordelia. She wasn't asleep, or perhaps she had slept and woken, or perhaps she had lain there listening to everything below, and waited until the house was truly still before beginning. She sang. Not the proposal song, not Briar's nameless melody, a different tune, slow and soft, a melody only she knew, perhaps one she had written herself, or one she had heard from someone long before there had been a stage and a spotlight and a man at the corner table. That fragile voice drifted through the ceiling, through 2 stories, and out into the garden where the 2 of them sat on the steps. She sang for herself, for them, for the house that had finally found its sound. Reed Calloway had once believed that money could buy every solution. He had been wrong. 6 nurses, 3 doctors, hundreds of thousands of dollars poured into medicine and equipment and specialists, and none of it had made his mother leave that bed. But one girl with nothing except a humming voice and the understanding of someone who had lived through darkness. She had made Cordelia rise, walk, and sing again. The thing that truly keeps a person standing isn't found in a safe, or a contract, or a bank account. It lives in the hum of a voice, at 5 in the morning when no one is listening. In a dusty vinyl record that someone wipes clean and places on the turntable without pressing play. In a $3.50 bouquet of chrysanthemums, set in an empty porcelain vase. In a hot cup of coffee every morning that no one claims to have made. and in the person willing to stay long enough after the rest of the world has gone. Kindness, when it is given with a whole heart, doesn't only heal the body, it heals the soul. And that, more than anything else, is what truly keeps us standing. The story ends here, but I want to ask you something. In your life, has there ever been someone who stayed when you thought the whole world had walked away? Or the other way around? Have you ever been the one who chose to stay for someone else? Sometimes we don't need the smartest person, the richest person, or the most powerful person. We only need the one willing to listen, willing to stay, willing to see us when no one else even tries. Share your story in the comments below, because I would truly love to hear what lives deep inside your heart. If this story touched you, please press like, so I'll know you're here. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change an entire day. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, this is the moment. Press subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our daily videos. I want to wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and always someone beside you when you need them most. Thank you for being here all the way to the very end. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.